Davin stood by the warped glass panel of his shelter, watching the last shards of ice slide down the polymer and vanish into the gutter. The storm had broken hours ago, but the cold still seeped through the seams of the walls. He hadn't stepped outside in 2 days. Not because of the weather, he'd lived through worse, but because the quiet was a dangerous place for his thoughts to linger. Gray Line had a way of dragging old memories out of hiding, and lately they'd been coming too often. The alert ping cut through the silence, sharp and sterile. He glanced at the battered console. Audit findings confirmed. Immediate attendance. Required. Overseer Van. No signature, no details. Davin could feel the tension coiled behind every clipped word. This wasn't a debrief. It was a message. And he knew enough about messages on Gray Line to recognize a threat when it came dressed as an invitation. He pulled on his coat, fingers stiff from disuse, and stepped into the cold. The colony sprawled low against the endless slate horizon, a scattering of domes and blocky structures clinging to life in the frozen waste. Officially, Race 7 was a stalled terraforming project. Unofficially, it was a graveyard of abandoned promises. The wind carried fine crystal dust that chewed through gear and skin alike, whispering against his hood like a thing alive. The lift at the perimeter checkpoint groaned as it descended, a single flickering panel casting pale green light down the shaft. Davin adjusted his collar and stepped off into the administrative corridor, metal walls dented, lights flickering, air stale. The guards outside Van's office didn't speak. One coughed into a gloved fist. The other stared at him with the hollow patience of a man who'd stopped caring years ago. Inside, Van was smiling. His smile was a polished thing, practiced and empty. "Mr. Terran," he said, spreading his arms as if greeting an old friend. "Your latest audit thorough. Enlightening. You've uncovered quite the knot in our supply chain. Misrouted shipments, falsified work orders. The kind of mess that, in the wrong hands, could embarrass this colony. Lucky for us, you fixed it." Davin said nothing. He'd reported the truth, nothing more. "And for that," Van continued, steepling his fingers, "you deserve a reward." The door behind Davin opened. 2 guards entered, leading someone between them. She looked as if she'd been carved from another story. Green. Skin, deep as moss after rain. Black hair hung in uneven ropes, hacked short and left to grow wild. A thin shift clung to her shoulders, offering nothing against the cold. Heavy, rust-pitted cuffs circled her wrists, chains dragging between them. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. He could feel the stillness radiating off her. Not the stillness of the broken, but of someone holding themselves in place. "She's yours," Van said, gesturing with casual cruelty. "Companionship is important for morale, especially out here on the edge. She's untagged. Register her however you prefer." "No." The word slipped out before Davin could stop it. Van's smile thinned. "I'd hate to discover errors in your calculations, Tiaran. Falsified numbers have a way of spreading." The meaning was clear. Accept the gift or accept the consequences. Davin met the woman's downcast eyes for the first time. They were open, watching, even as her head remained bowed. He forced his voice steady. "I'll take her." "Excellent choice," Van said, waving them out. The walk back to his shelter was 15 minutes through slush-veiled ground and dust-laced air. She followed without a word, bare feet leaving fleeting prints in the frost. Inside, the prefab smelled of old metal and boiled broth. 2 rooms, 1 heater, 1 narrow bed, enough for a quiet man with no need for comfort. He let her in first, then closed the door behind them. There were no words. He opened a crate, pulled out his small toolkit, and approached slowly. She tensed. When he knelt, eyes flicking up for just a heartbeat, the first click of the lock made her flinch. The second made her brace. On the third, he paused. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, but her shoulders eased. When the last shackle fell away, he stepped back. "There's food on the stove. Water's clean. You can sleep there." He nodded toward the cot, then picked up his bedroll and stepped outside. The tarp between the shelter and the generator shed rattled in the lingering wind as he lay down. The cold worked its way through the seams of his coat, but he closed his eyes and let it settle in his bones. Sometime in the night, the door hissed open. Light footsteps crossed the frozen ground. The weight of a blanket settled over him. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But her hand lingered on the edge of the fabric for just a moment before she stepped back into the shelter. It wasn't safety. Not yet, but it wasn't what either of them had expected. And for now, that was enough. Dawn on gray line was never a burst of light, only a slow bleed from black to rusted gray. Davin woke stiff, the thin blanket she'd placed over him still, tucked deliberately around his shoulders. He lay there for a few moments, letting the heater's faint hum inside the shelter tease at his imagination. It wasn't warmth that drew him in. It was the knowledge that she had chosen, unasked, to leave the cot and step into the cold for him. When he finally stepped inside, she was seated cross-legged on the floor near the stove, her back to the warm wall. She didn't startle, didn't shift, just watched him with the same steady eyes he'd seen in Van's office. The blanket she'd used for him lay folded neatly at her side. The air between them carried no words, but it didn't need to. Not yet. He lit the stove and set water to boil. She didn't follow his movements, but her awareness was constant. He could feel it, the way her breath slowed when he bent near. The flame, the way her head tilted slightly toward the sound of water beginning to hiss. When he handed her a metal cup of broth, she accepted without hesitation, sipping slowly this time. "I'm going to the fields," he said quietly, lacing his boots, back before midday. The fungal domes clung to the frozen landscape like pale tumors, their surfaces webbed with mineral streaks. He checked valve lines, scraped frost from intake vents, adjusted a pressure gauge that had been running hot for weeks. Usually, the work gave him room to let his mind wander. Today, it stayed anchored to the image of her sitting by the stove, eyes on him without fear. When he returned, the shelter smelled faintly of steam and damp cloth. She had washed. Her hair, darker now from water, clung to her shoulders in uneven strands. The basin was empty. A cleaning rag hung neatly to dry. She sat near the cot, legs tucked beneath her, watching the stove. Davin unwound his scarf and crouched to lay strips of dried fungus rat over the heat plate. They curled quickly, releasing a metallic tang. "You can take the cot," he said without looking up. "I'll stay by the door." She didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. When he plated 2 equal portions and handed one to her, she ate deliberately, each bite measured. The silence had changed, less heavy, less about defense. "I'll go to salvage tomorrow," he said after they finished. "Get you boots, warmer clothes, maybe a knife, if they don't ask questions." That made her pause. She looked down at her wrists, scars catching the firelight, thin, pale lines against green skin. Not fresh, but not yet faded. He wondered if she'd ever been trusted with a weapon before. After the dishes were cleaned, he poured a pot of water and left it beside her with a folded cloth. She took it without a word, turning her back as she began to wash. He stepped outside, letting the cold bite at his face. It wasn't guilt sitting heavy in his chest. Not exactly. It was older than that, a weight he'd carried since the day he'd stopped asking questions about the ones who disappeared. When he came back in, she was wrapped in the thermal blanket she'd given him the night before. Her gaze found him as he settled by the door with his bedroll. She spoke for the first time since Van's office, her voice dry from disuse. Why? He met her eyes. I don't know yet, but I didn't want them to have you. Her expression didn't soften, but something in her posture shifted, and for the first time, he felt the balance between them tilt ever so slightly toward something neither of them had expected. The days on Gray Line were measured not by the sun, which never rose or set, but by the slow drift of the sky's color from rusted steel to ashen black and back again. Davin found a rhythm in that sameness. So did she. It began with small changes. When he left for the fungal domes, she would no longer sit in the farthest corner of the shelter. Instead, she lingered near the stove, tidying the few belongings. He kept stacking tools in silent order. When he returned, the pot would be warm, water boiled without him asking. She didn't speak, but her movements began to read like sentences short, cautious, but deliberate. By the third morning, she followed him outside. No request, no question, just fell into step behind him. Her bare feet were silent on the frost-hardened path. The fungal fields rose ahead, the rounded domes glistening with frozen condensation. Air misters pulsing nutrient mist every few seconds. He glanced at her as they approached. Each dome gets fed twice a day, he explained, voice low as though speaking to the mist itself. Miss a cycle, and the roots start dying. She crouched beside him as he adjusted a valve, pressing a fingertip into the skin of a bulbous fungus. The flesh gave slightly, then rebounded. Not native. She murmured, smells wrong. You can tell? My people used to grow food in caves. Similar method. Different smell. It was the first personal thing she'd told him. He didn't press. Just let it settle in the space between them. 2 days later, her laugh broke the silence for the first time. It came by accident when a fungus rat, small and ugly as sin, darted out from under a sprayer pipe. Davin tried to shoo it off with his boot. The creature dodged, looped back, and bolted straight between his legs, sending him stumbling sideways into a slush-filled ditch. By the time he limped back to the shelter, muttering under his breath, she was sewing a tear in one of the gloves. Her eyes lifted to his sodden arm, and back to his face. The sound that escaped her was brief, breathy, unguarded, a laugh unpolished from long disuse. He froze in the doorway. She bit down on her lip as if she could push the sound back inside, but her eyes stayed lit. Glad I could be useful. He said, setting his tools aside. You looked like you were wrestling it. I was. Did you win? Not sure, he admitted. She handed him a dry cloth. You lost. They didn't speak much for the rest of the day, but the air between them had shifted again. It wasn't warmer exactly, but lighter. That night, when the wind rattled the south wall, he found himself lying awake on his bedroll, thinking not of Van's threats or the faces that had vanished from the colony, but of the sound of her laugh-howl. It had landed in the shelter like a drop of color on a blank canvas. He didn't know it yet, but the quiet between them was no longer the quiet of strangers. It was the kind of silence that waited for what might come next. The cold came hard and sudden, as it always did on Gray Line. One day the frost clung politely to the edges of the domes, and the next it bit into metal and skin with teeth that wouldn't let go. The sky turned the color of tarnished iron, and the wind carried fine shards of ice that stung the face like ground glass. Davin worked through it. There were pipes to insulate, cracks in the intake lines to seal, and a stubborn regulator that had been sticking for weeks. He could feel the chill seeping through his gloves, numbing his fingers, but he kept going, breath steaming in quick bursts. By midday, his shoulders ached, and his knuckles felt like they were carved from stone. He didn't notice the warning signs, the creeping heaviness in his limbs, the hollow pull in his chest, until his wrench slipped from his hand and clanged against the frost-hardened ground. The sound seemed far away. He took one step back, then another, and the edges of his vision turned gray. The walk to the shelter was a blur. He didn't remember opening the door, only the sensation of warm air hitting his frozen skin and the sharp gasp that came from Lyria. She was on him in an instant, voice low but sharp. "Sit. No, lie down." Her hands were quick, tugging at the fastenings of his coat, pulling the soaked fabric from his shoulders. The cold bit deeper as she stripped him down to his undershirt, then wrapped him in every blanket they had, his teeth chattered, muscles twitching with delayed shivers. She lit the stove to full heat, filled a pot with water, and set it to boil. "Stay awake," she ordered, glancing over her shoulder at him. "I'm fine," he tried to say, but his voice came out thin and slurred. "No, you're not." Crossed the room with the emergency thermal pack from the supply shelf, pressing it against his chest. The heat seeped through slowly, a dull ache as feeling returned by nightfall. The shivering had stopped, but so had his strength. His eyes closed without his permission. Somewhere in the haze, he heard her voice, quiet and steady, speaking to him even when he couldn't answer. On the second night, the fever came. She sat beside him with a damp cloth, cooling his forehead, spooning broth between his lips when he stirred. Once, his eyes opened just enough to find hers. "Don't go," he murmured, voice thick. "I'm here," she whispered. When the fever finally broke on the third day, he woke to the sound of the stove and the faint scrape of her chair moving closer. She was still there, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep but steady as ever. "You stayed," he said, voice rough. "Of course." "Thank you. You don't have to thank me." He shook his head, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. "I didn't give you anything. I just stopped taking." Her gaze lingered on him, unreadable, before she looked back to the stove. The quiet between them now wasn't just survival. It was something heavier, stronger, something that neither of them could name yet, but both could feel. That night, she didn't sleep in the cot. She rolled her blanket out on the floor, beside his, and lay there, her hand loosely around his. And for the first time since he'd arrived on Grey Line, Davin Tiarn didn't dream of cold Dot by the time Davin was steady enough to walk without the world tilting beneath him. The frost had begun to ease. Not warmth, not on Grey Line, but the wind's bite dulled just enough that errands no longer felt like a fight for survival. The heater in the shelter still needed new coils. The water line still leaked, and the stockpile of winter root was running thin. They would have to go into the heart of the colony. Lyria didn't ask to stay behind. She simply pulled on the salvaged boots he'd traded for, cinched the thermal tunic tighter at her waist, and fell into step beside him. Their pace was matched, their silence companionable. The deeper they walked into the colony's core, the more eyes followed them. Conversations stuttered into half-finished words. Davin could feel it, the weight of old expectations pressing on every glance. On Grey Line, an alien woman walking free at a man's side was more than strange. It was provocative. The requisitions. Counter sat at the far end of the trading hall, a long slab of worn composite, manned by a clerk with a permanent sneer in his voice. Davin slid his list across without ceremony. Heating coils, sealant tape, a thermal blanket. The clerk scanned it without looking up, his gaze drifting instead to Lyria. "Still bringing her around, huh? Surprised you haven't traded up." "Heard. There's a new batch in from the outer moons." Davin's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Lyria stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpened edge in it. "You speak too freely." The man blinked. "Excuse me?" "You think I won't remember you," she said, closing the space between them with deliberate slowness. "That people like me don't keep track, but we do. You see me and think of property. I see you and think of rot." His smirk faltered, eyes darting toward Davin as if for backup. "This is my wife." Davin said, his voice low but carrying enough weight to cut through the hum of the hall. "If you speak to her like that again, you won't be speaking to anyone." The silence that followed was absolute. The clerk shoved the supplies across the counter, hands suddenly quick, eyes fixed anywhere but on them. They left without another word. It wasn't until they were halfway back to the shelter that Lyria spoke. "Wife," she said, glancing at him sideways. Davin didn't look at her. Felt right. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary before nodding once. It did. Inside, the air was warmer than it had been for days. She set the supplies neatly against the wall, then paused, watching him as he stowed the blanket in its crate. There was something new in her stillness, not the braced quiet of someone expecting the worst, but the measured calm of someone weighing the truth and finding it solid. That night, when the heater hummed steadily and the wind rattled only faintly against the panels, the distance between cot and bedroll was smaller than it had ever been. Not touching, not yet, but closer. And in that small, quiet space, the word wife no longer felt like a shield. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to imagine before. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm neither of them named, but both lived in. The shelter changed first. The crates that once sat haphazardly against. The walls were stacked and sorted. Tools hung neatly from salvaged hooks. Food and water rations arranged so he could see at a glance what they had left. Above the heater, she'd suspended 2 converted air filters, now cradling small bundles of heat moss. They caught moisture from the vent and released a faint, clean scent into the air. It didn't look like his shelter anymore. It looked like theirs. One evening, after a day of patching a stubborn leak in the water line, Davin found her at the stove, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hair tied back with a strip of dyed cloth. She was stirring a pot of root and fungus stew, the smell richer than anything he'd ever managed to make from the same ingredients. "You don't have to keep calling me your wife," she said, without looking up. He set down the coil of sealant tape he'd been carrying. "I don't? You did it to protect me." Her voice was matter-of-fact, not accusing. "I didn't," he said. "Not only that." She turned then, the steam curling between them. "Then why?" "Because I want to." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, the kind of quiet that made it clear she'd heard him, weighed it, and found no falsehood in it. Her breathing shifted just enough for him to notice, shoulders easing beneath the worn fabric of her tunic. After they ate, she set her bowl aside and crossed the small room to stand in front of him. Her gaze held steady, but there was a flicker of vulnerability at its edges. "I've shared this space." Shared food, silence, fire. Her hand rose, resting lightly over her chest. "But I haven't shared this." He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. "You don't have to." "No," she said. "That's why I want to." He felt his breath deepen slow. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure." When he cupped her face, it wasn't to claim her, but to honor the moment. His hands were rough from cold and work, but his touch was careful, deliberate. She leaned into it, the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, breaking her usual guarded stillness. Their first kiss was slow, unhurried. Not hunger, not conquest, just arrival. The warmth between them wasn't the frantic kind that burned out quickly. It was steady, grounding. They moved with the same patience they'd given each other since the first day, unwrapping layers of fabric and history, one at a time. When she drew him down beside her on the cot, his weight over her, there was no hesitation in her touch. She met his gaze through it all, as though memorizing the way he looked in that moment. Later, tangled together beneath the blankets, her head rested against his chest, her fingers tracing slow lines along his ribs. "I want to build something with you," she whispered. "Even here?" "Especially here." If something can grow in this place, it means it's real enough to survive anywhere. He didn't answer, but he tightened his arm around her. Outside, the wind moaned across the frozen flats, searching for ways in. Inside, the warmth held. And for the first time, neither of them felt like they were just surviving. The morning broke softer than usual on Gray Line. The air still carried its familiar bite, but the frost didn't cling so fiercely to the walls, and a thin, muted glow seeped through the clouds. Davin stood outside with a coil of synth rope over his shoulder, watching the fungal domes exhale plumes of mist into the chill. Behind him, the shelter door slid open, and Lyria stepped out. Her hair was bound back with a moss-dyed cloth. Her sleeves rolled past her elbows. In each hand, she carried a steaming mug, one of which she passed to him without a word. They stood side by side, drinking in the thin quiet. The cold didn't feel as sharp with her. There, by midday, they were working together beneath the dome. Canopy's hymn clearing a clogged sprayer head, her tightening the patch on a regulator line. The rhythm between them was second nature now, no instructions needed. When the work was done, they walked back to the shelter with the contentment of a day well spent. The sound of engines shattered it. A deep, pulsing thrum rolled across the colony, not the constant hum of the processing plant or the low whine of supply drones, but something heavier, closer. They turned toward the source just as a matte-black council scoutcraft descended into the main compound, scattering dust and slush in its wake. Davin felt the shift in the air before the knock came. It was too sharp, too certain. When he opened the door, Overseer Van stood framed in the dim light, flanked by two armored escorts whose rifles were already unhooked from their shoulders. "You've been busy." "Tiarin," Van said, his voice almost cheerful. "I'll make this quick. You've been harboring a priority fugitive." His gaze slid past Davin to Lyria, who stood behind him, unmoving. "Property of the Council, and worth more than you can imagine." Davin didn't move, but his fingers tightened on the door frame. "She's not property." Van's smirk sharpened. "She's the last living daughter of the Lorian High Council. There's a bounty that could keep this colony running for a decade. And I had the order to retrieve her weeks ago when I put her in your hands." His eyes glittered with satisfaction. "You were a test, Tiarin, to see if you'd toe the line or choke on it." He heard Lyria step closer, felt her presence at his side. "And now?" Davin asked. "Now," Van said. "You hand her over, and we all pretend you didn't just commit treason." The silence stretched until it hummed in Davin's ears. He glanced at Lyria, and she met his eyes without fear. No words passed between them. None were needed. Her hand settled lightly against his arm, not holding him back, but steadying him. When he turned back to Van, his voice was calm. "No." The Overseer's smile faltered. "Think very carefully." "I have," Davin cut in. He stepped back into the shelter, crossing to the wall where his tools hung. Lyria moved with him, retrieving the salvaged knife from the shelf. The synth rope went over his shoulder. The knife slid into her belt. They didn't pack much, just what could be, carried without slowing them down. Outside, the escorts shifted uneasily, unsure if this was bluster or intent. When Davin opened the door again, Van was still there, but the smugness had drained from his face. "You're making a mistake," Van said. Davin stepped past him, Lyria, matching his stride. "No," he said, "I'm making a choice." The cold met them in full as they crossed the compound. Neither looked back. They followed the edge of the fungal fields until the domes fell away behind them, the horizon opening wide and pale ahead. The wind cut across their faces, but it felt clean, untainted by the walls they were leaving. Van had thought she was his reward, a token to bind him to the colony's rules. But as the frozen horizon stretched before them, Davin knew the truth was simpler. She wasn't a reward. She was his choice.